Greetings, friends. I've been using Linux for about 20 years as my primary desktop, and I thought, based on that experience, I would put together a list of reasons why you might want to consider using Linux. So here is my list in no particular order of the benefits of using Linux on your computer. First of all, I believe Linux promotes freedom, so it's free as in freedom. Linux is also free as in free beer, meaning no cost. Linux provides security, stability, it's useful. I believe it promotes computer literacy. It's easy to use and it's even pretty to look at. So free as in freedom. This is a phrase that you often hear in open source or free software forums or in those circles. And I think what they mean by this, what I understand it to mean, is that with open source software, you control the computer. You know what the computer's up to. If you're not in charge, then who is? With commercial software, there's no way to know what the computer's actually doing with the data it's generating or the data that you're putting into it or that the data that it's gathering about you. As our world is becoming increasingly computerized and computers play a bigger role in our lives, I think it's even more important, increasingly important, to take charge and be in control of these machines that help run our lives. The other aspect in which Linux promotes freedom is that your ability to use the software for any task is explicitly guaranteed by the software license that it's used to distribute the software. This is in stark contrast with most commercial licenses that are designed to limit what you can do with the software. Part of this is your ability to study and modify the software. This is explicitly guaranteed. It's also free as in free beer, meaning no cost. This is really an artifact of the software license that Linux is used to, that Linux is distributed with. There's this idea that Linux is software as a service and not as a product. So making money off Linux is okay. In fact, a lot of people do. But the software itself isn't what's exchanged for money. It's rather expertise, or you would hire somebody to create a software program for you or to maintain the software. And this is the way software was traditionally created and distributed up until, well, maybe the PC revolution and Microsoft, where they convince people to pay for something that has zero manufacturing cost. Linux development is an example of something called a gift economy. This is how Wikipedia defines a gift economy. It's a culture or a mode of exchange where valuables are not traded or sold, but rather given without an explicit agreement for immediate or future rewards. So there's some aspect to this. A lot of people are motivated to develop software for Linux because they find a lot of value in using Linux. So it's a way of giving back or paying it forward. There's other motivations, of course, but that's, I think, the primary motivation for most of the independent developers that make Linux happen. Another advantage of Linux is security. Linux is the most secure operating system you can use. That's my take on it. Now, over these 20 years that I've been using Linux, one of the factoids that always rattled around in my head is that there had never been a virus ever seen in the wild that affected Linux. Now, most of us view viruses as something inevitable, and it's an inevitable part of computing, but that's really not the case if you're using quality software. So I found this quote in Wikipedia. I was curious if this was still true. So January 2021, there has not been a single widespread Linux virus or malware infection of the type that is common in Microsoft Windows. This is attributable generally to the malware's lack of root access and fast updates to most Linux vulnerabilities. Now, I happen to disagree a little bit with that, with a reason. I think it speaks to the quality of the software. Linux is designed with security in mind. It's not just a kludge, kind of after the fact sloppy add-on as with Windows. Again, my opinion. Linux is made by users for users, so there's no incentive to include backdoors or built-in snoopware as with Windows. They've been caught many times promising to protect your privacy and collecting your data and sending it back. I mean, I remember as early as Windows 95, they would get caught with these, collecting your data when they had promised not to, etc. Now, this might seem surprising to some because I just finished telling you how it was free as in no cost. So how can something of no cost also be of high value? And if you're really curious, there's a book that I think does a good job explaining it. It's called The Cathedral and the Bazaar by Eric Raymond. And he describes a little bit about the open source software development model that produces higher quality software than what can be done commercially. Stability. Maybe this is the other the flip side of the same coin as security. It basically quality software is not going to be vulnerable and it will be stable. But Linux is famous for being stable. It's a variant of Unix that was designed for server use, mainframe use. Linux is quality software. Companies like IBM, Hewlett-Packard, etc., they support Linux not necessarily because they're all that interested in human freedom and human dignity. They just want access to powerful software that works reliably. Apple Mac OS X is basically a Unix variant, and because it was easier to make Unix pretty than to make Windows work. I didn't come up with that. I think it's funny and true. I saw that somewhere on the internet, so I credit it anonymous. This was also a common meme back in the 90s. Microsoft Software Quality is job 1.1, and we all know what that means, right? We expect version 1.0 of the software to suck. It's not the case with Linux. A lot of the times the software is incredibly powerful, useful, and stable from version 0.3 or pre-alpha stage. And again, because of the development model. It's useful. So Linux can be used for anything you might want to use a computer for. Spreadsheets, word processing, browsing the web, video editing, image editing, video gaming, which I left out. Here I show an icon of the GIMP, which is, as I understand it, a feature-for-feature complete replacement of Photoshop. So anything you can do with Photoshop, you can do with the GIMP. And in fact, a lot of these very useful software programs that were developed for use within the Linux environment are also available for Windows and Mac. So I believe Linux also leads to computer literacy, and partially, well, mostly this is due to the fact that the operating system is designed for you to use. You're not locked out of any aspect of the operating system. It's all exposed. It's all open. If you want to dig in, you can use it as you would any other operating system. You don't have to get into the weeds. You can just use it like you use your Mac OS, point and click, and be productive and creative. But if you ever have a problem that you want to solve, or you want to change some aspect of how the software works, or if you like to tinker, everything's documented, everything's accessible now. I'm not saying that if you install Linux, you will automatically become Mr. Linux Tron super user like I have here on the right. That's how I picture these Unix system administrators. That guy's probably a total badass. So, you install it, you won't automatically become Mr. Tron guy, but I think it does promote a better understanding of how computers work. And I think we've all experienced this, right? With commercial software, we're used to the idea that if something's not working, we reinstall or reboot because that's about all we can do. Or if you've spent a lot of time poking around with Windows, you know that there's the registry, you can go in there, but it's messy, it's not well documented, it's not a comfortable environment to operate in. So you would be, I think, giddy if you ever got a chance to play around with Linux and you like to tinker. So it's not a black box, right? And I do think this fosters learned helplessness. That's with commercial software. So, and then the other aspect of computer literacy is that world-class software development tools are built right in. So if that is your cup of tea and you want to get started with programming, or modifying how programs work, which may be how you get your feet wet into programming, all the tools are right there. They're built in. Nothing else to buy, and they are top-notch. Ease of use. So a lot of effort over the decades has been put into creating a first-rate user experience. So Linux is not just one distribution. Different groups get together and create their own versions of what they think the perfect operating system is. It's all Linux. It all can communicate, and but they group themselves in something called distributions. So, for instance, Ubuntu is one of the first distributions that came out that put a lot of money, in fact, into making it pretty and putting a lot of effort into creating usability guidelines. And I picked it also because I like the tagline, right? Linux for human beings, highlighting that this was not for computer science people or just for geeks. This was meant for the everyday person that needs to be creative or productive with their computer. Now, Linux also tends to just work. Once you get it up and running, you don't need to defrag. You don't need to run antivirus. It doesn't fall apart through normal use, as happens with Windows, and maybe we've all experienced this, that you reinstall Windows and all of a sudden the computer runs better. That the whole thing's kind of fragile and it just falls apart from normal use. The other thing too is there is no such thing as antivirus in Linux. It's just not needed. So you're not running these extraneous programs that really, it's kind of sad that we've come to expect be part of normal computing. Another reason, aesthetics, it's actually pretty. Linux porn, it's actually a phrase that's commonly used. It's almost a safe for work Google search. So if you do a search on Google or your favorite search engine, you will come up with forums devoted to people showcasing how pretty or useful or a combination of both they've managed to make their desktop. I don't recommend doing a image search of Linux porn because some unsavory things do come up, but generally speaking, it's a thing that's always existed because that's always been also a focal point of Linux. So here I've got a screenshot. I think this came from a Reddit forum called Unix porn. I don't know what this is. It's some desktop, but it's colorful, it's pretty, and I want to show you that running Linux doesn't mean that you're just sitting behind a text box matrix style just watching text fly by, and you need to be a computer geek to make use of it. In fact, a lot of the distributions are insanely pretty, are very pretty, and that's what actually originally motivated me. I was using Windows 95 or 98, whatever at the time, and it was pretty shabby compared to what these Unix and Linux guys were showcasing. And again, this is also partially born out of the fact that you are free to modify it in any which way you can, and people get very creative, and they share. You can download their themes, you can download their icon sets, etc., and make your desktop look like theirs, or come up with something on your own. It's very configurable, more than you're used to. Sadly, we've gotten used to, just being told how the computer will look and behave. So I thought it wouldn't be fair to not give you some reasons why you may not want to use Linux. I think the biggest drawback for most, or the biggest hurdle, I should say, is that it's not pre-installed. Some elbow grease is required. Now, the upshot is that installing it is actually not hard, and it's gotten just easier and easier over the years. There's a lot of tutorials, and I plan on putting some out. And anybody from Luminary who wants to reach out, I'd be happy to help you with the installation process. I've done it many times. Another potential downfall is that it's not officially supported. So some hardware, especially old or specialized hardware, if you've got a scanner from the early 90s or, I don't know, a 3D printer, it may not work with Linux, so you should look into it before you wipe your Windows computer. This is not a big deal for most users. So unless you're running something old or exotic, it won't be a problem. Linux will just install on the same PC that you're running second-rate Microsoft software on. And in fact, hardware configuration tends to be easier than it is on Windows or Mac. For the most part, you just plug it in, and Linux so it's sophisticated enough to auto-detect and auto-configure most things that you would want to use, generally speaking. So I mentioned the biggest hurdle is that it's not installed. The biggest drawback actually might be that most Windows software that you're used to probably won't work on Linux. Now, let me just say that a lot of the software that you're using, you may not be aware, is open source and started off in Linux. And I'm talking about Firefox, the Brave browser, they're open source. VLC, the media player, um, drawing a blank. A lot of apps were just so excellent that they crossed over into the Windows world and beat and replaced all these commercial applications because they were just better. So it's possible that some of the applications that you like and love on Windows or Mac are actually native to Linux, and you can continue using them. But certain things like Photoshop is one example that comes to mind. You know, if you're a professional photographer and you've been using it for 10 years and you've got a high level expertise, then well, it's something to consider. Photoshop, there's no way Adobe is ever going to want to cooperate with Linux. But having said all that, equal or better alternatives for most things that you use exist on Linux, likely. And there are some other workarounds, such as Wine, which allows you to use and run Windows programs on Linux. You know, oftentimes not without some configuration or some elbow grease. It's really, I think, a last resort, but it is there. So anyway, these are some of the reasons. I hope I got some of you interested in learning more and checking it out, and I hope this was useful.